make it like everybody try and find a way to be a theory of everything. Yeah, it's like
still working.
Plurality like needs to thrive, I think.
Cool. We'll get going if that's all right. Yeah. Welcome all to this event. Sorry if you got stuck in the lift or had to come up the stairs. And yeah, slightly more people turned out than I expected, so we've had to pull a few more chairs in, but that's nice. It's lovely to see a packed room. Welcome to Demos. I'm Ben Glover. I'm the head of social policy here. I lead our work on public service reform. This is part of our Public Services 2030 network. We host monthly events here and online, focusing on public service reform. We have 7 excellent partners for that work. I'm going to try and remember their names now. First, the Centre for Public Impact, who we have co-curated this event with, and we'll hear a bit from them shortly before we kick off. Also working with CIPFA, More Than a Provider, Read in Partnership, Policy at Manchester, the WEA, and the Institute of Employability Professionals. Got all of that right. So yeah, very welcome for their generous support to make these events happen. Housekeeping will run till 7:15 p.m, no later. There's a fire exit to the right. We're not expecting any alarms. There's a toilet to the right of the lift. And if you need a drink or anything, just help yourself. So I'm just going to sort of give us a brief overview of what we're going to be speaking about, introduce the speakers, and then we'll let them do the talking and let you guys do the talking as well. That's kind of the point of these things. So public service reform is back on the agenda in Westminster, and I think that's a very good thing. And at Demos, we're playing a role in trying to define what that new paradigm of public service delivery looks like, along with loads of other organisations. And I think a big part of that is how do you actually imagine what a better state, or the process of how we get there is really important, especially when people have argued that we're facing a kind of a crisis or a deficit of what people call social imagination, something which Jeff Mulgan, the founder of Demos, has played a kind of big role in popularising, as have some of the panelists here tonight. So collective imagination is something we're going to talk about a lot this evening. I think a tentative definition is it's about bringing together different people, different communities, people from diverse backgrounds to try and imagine how their world could be different and how they can do that together. But we're going to hear lots more practical examples of what that looks like from the panelists and from you guys. So yeah, essentially what we're going to be looking at tonight is, can collective imagination unlock that public services revolution that we all want to see? And we've got 3 brilliant panelists here tonight to talk through all of this with us. So on the furthest left, we've got Sophia Parker. Sophia is the Director of Emerging Futures at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Before that role, she set up Little Village, a great charity focused on child poverty in South London. Also used to work here at Demos, so it's lovely to welcome you back. To her left is Immy Kaur. Immy is the director and founder of Civic Square, a public square and neighbourhood lab in the great city of Birmingham. We'll be hearing a lot more from Immy about all things Civic Square later. And to her left, I'm delighted to be joined by Donna Hall. Donna has done many things in a very interesting and exciting looking career, including being the former chief executive of Wigan Council, where she was instrumental in the Wigan deal, a really interesting and pioneering approach to casting a new relationship between the local council and residents. So that's our panelists. That's what we're going to be talking about. I'm going to quickly pass to Aurora to say a few words. Aurora's from, well, let Aurora introduce yourself, but yeah. Thank you.
I just stand in them.
Yeah, wherever. Yeah.
Donna block, Donna. Firstly, apologies. My colleague Ruth was supposed to be here speaking, so I will be reading from a sheet and trying to do my best impression of her. But yeah, thank you very much. Just want to say a quick few words before the panelists start, just around why we were really pleased to be able to partner with Demos and convene this conversation around collective imagination and public services. And at the Centre for Public Impact, we work with others in the public sector and the voluntary sector as well to really explore about how government can be reimagined. And core to that is really rethinking the relationship that government has with the public. And we know that trust between government and communities is essential for the effectiveness of public policies, and it is the foundation of any well-functioning government. Yet we found that relationships between governments and the public have tended to fray worldwide in recent years due to top-down decision-making, a lack of transparency, and so frequently treating members of the public simply as customers or service users rather than collaborators and partners. And that has further fueled a growing chasm between governments and the communities that they're supposed to represent. And that can be particularly damaging for marginalized individuals and communities who are often the least well represented and whose voices and experiences are often not heard when shaping public services. And this really matters, at least in our opinion, because governments can then become more harmful than helpful, actively harming some individuals and communities and perpetuating inequalities in broader society through unjust laws, policies, and service provision. It also matters because governments and public services are failing to harness the collective strengths of communities and are therefore not tapping into the wisdom and knowledge of the people who are closest to the problems that we're all trying to solve. We believe that governments need to create genuine partnerships with communities, whether that's by creating spaces for authentic listening and community engagement, adopting more open and deliberative democratic methods, or sharing decision making. And one area that we've been keen to begin exploring at CPI is collective imagination. Innovation and imagination have been driving progress for as long as humans have walked the earth, but the spaces for imagination have become constrained over time in government and public services, as well as other parts of society, often by the need for quick wins, measurable outcomes, and top-down bureaucratic control. So how can we rebuild our collective capacity to imagine different futures? As kind of Ben alluded to, collective imagination is one of the terms used for what is an emerging field of practice that is really growing in momentum as people across government and public services seek to move away from a sense of hopelessness to one of imagining new possibilities. And though there are many different definitions, collective imagination, at least as we define it, is often about bringing people together from lots of different backgrounds, experiences and perspectives to really collectively imagine new worlds that break out of the cycles of depletion and injustice that we feel stuck in, and paying attention to pockets of the future that are already emerging today. At CPI, we ourselves are embarking on a journey to understand the role of collective imagination in supporting democracy at local levels. So we just started hosting a peer-to-peer learning journey this week, which is part of the collective imagination practice community that JRF is supporting. And as part of that learning journey, we will be bringing people together from around the world to collectively explore perspectives, practices, and possibilities for reimagining local democracy. But there's, of course, lots of other interesting work already taking place in this growing field. So I'm really excited to hear what our panelists are about to say on these topics and also to hear the discussion with you all.
Thank you, Rory. Cheers. That was great. Thank you. I'm going to ask Sophia to make some opening remarks, if that's all right, and sort of reflect on maybe what you're doing at JRF and how you interpret collective imagination. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. 20 years ago, I was at Demos, and I have to say, the offices are much smarter than they were back there when we were in some scrappy back room in London Bridge. But anyway, it's really nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And I want to start really by reflecting on why we're having this conversation in the first place. Why is it that we're all here talking about imagination and public services? And to do that, I want to tell you about a couple of panels that I hosted last week. The first of them was with two amazing people, Gemma Mortensen and Joe Brewer, both of them working to imagine and build different futures, better, more beautiful futures in their language. And on that panel, they told a story of how we are transgressing multiple planetary boundaries. They also told a story of hope and possibility of how we might come back from this brink that we stand on. But actually, rather than telling you more about what they said, I think the thing I want to share is the reactions to that panel in the room, which I think, well, the first set of reactions were really ones of fear. People had quite a visceral reaction of kind of anxiety, people saying, I find this really hard to engage in, the sort of the scale of the challenge you're telling us about. It makes me fear for my kids, someone said. So there's this sort of reaction to the crisis moment we're in of fear. It's too hard to look at. It's too much to take on in one go. There was another reaction in the room, which was a slightly kind of eye-rolly, get real. And I think we heard it as well. I don't know if any of you have listened to Kate Rayworth being interviewed by Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, some nods around the room, where her work was sort of dismissed as utopia. And actually her comeback to the interviewers was, well, why don't you tell me why your position is right? And I think there is I'm really fascinated by what it is that these realists and pragmatists think they've got, and how it is that we're in a world where imagination and dreaming of better futures is dismissed as this sort of folksy, woke whimsy. I don't get it, but it's very interesting to see how powerful that reaction is to when people do try and talk about how things might be better and how things could change. So that was the first panel. The second panel was completely different. It was with a bunch of Labour insiders. And the story they told was almost as hopeless in that they were talking about just the constraints that politicians are working in today. A very volatile electorate, extremely constrained public finances, scale of challenges that feel overwhelming. And you put those two panels together, and I think it's really, really important that to frame this conversation tonight, we do pause and say, like, what is going on here? What is the moment we're in? And I think it is a moment where the old world is no longer really making sense, but a new world hasn't yet emerged. And in that gap, what we see is fatalism and fear. And that makes it harder than ever to imagine alternatives. And I think then if you put alongside that what's going on outside of this room, JRF has been mapping destitution for a number of years, deep poverty, and we're seeing it going up. 6.5 million people in this country are living 40% below the median income. That is not enough money to heat your house or to eat, to provide for your children. So we are seeing this sort of crisis outside and a crisis in imagination. Both of them are going to have a material impact. So I think we just really need to hold on to the moment we're in and be willing to confront the scale of the crisis, because it's only then that you really start to see why imagination is just so critical at this point. We can't tinker around anymore. We've got to confront the scale of change that is needed. The good news, maybe, is that I think we've been here before. So if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, another time of great turbulence and change, kind of emergence of a new chapter in industrial capitalism, and also people like Rowntree, but also Charles Booth and others, mapping poverty and revealing the depth and scale of poverty across the country in a way that shocked the nation. And I think what we had then, if you look back, though, is a generation of men and women, Octavia Hill, Moore Pember Reeves, Beatrice Webb, many others, Beveridge, of course, as well, a generation of men and women who were willing to confront these seismic economic and social shifts and actually start to dream of something better. They didn't double down. They didn't try and just kind of keep calm and carry on. They said, no, let's imagine a new world and let's start building it. And actually, if you look back at the early years of the 20th century, it was a time of extraordinary innovation, from pensions, free school meals, expansion of midwifery, new houses, national insurance. I mean, it's one thing after another. And I think it's worth saying, you know, Beveridge is often presented as the dawn of a new era, but actually, I think he was the culmination, his report and the work that went, that's the culmination of a generation of experimentation and imagining alternatives. So maybe that's what we need to be doing today, generating, growing, building new ideas that will come together and form a new order. It's a bit messy, it doesn't all make sense now, but actually we have to be imagining alternatives now and thinking about how might they come together to actually become our response to this enormous change that we're going through, confronted by climate crisis, deepening inequality, and so on. So what do we need to do? I mean, I'm very happy to say a little bit more about JRF's work as part of the conversation, but I mean, just three things to leave you with as an opener. I do think we need to get better at telling the story of the moment we're in, and that story to be one of acute crisis, but also enormous possibility. Yes, there is huge amounts of political instability, growing inequality, fatalism, climate crisis, and so on. But there's also the beginnings of some imaginative reinvention in many sectors, looking at new hope across biodiversity, energy, finance, care. So we have to find a way of telling the story. It's quite complicated, of crisis and possibility. And I think that is then becomes an invitation to start a conversation about imagination. The second thing we need to do, I think, is tend to this very fragile visionary ecosystem. People like Immy represent it. Now, we have to make sure we're not just venerating them, inviting them to come and talk at panels like this about like the amazing work they're doing. We've got to back them. We've got to give them money. We've got to give them networks. We've got to enable them to do the work that they're doing of building alternatives now and showing what is possible. And I do not see, I work at a funder now, I do not see enough from philanthropy to do that, and to do that well and with the longevity that is needed when you're building something new. And then I think the third thing we need to do is really pay attention to the soil, the roots, where this is where the roots take hold of new ideas. And I think we talk a lot at JRF about the soil and what's happening in the soil. If we try and transform systems and services without paying attention to that soil and how it's being nourished, how it's being nurtured, basically what we're doing is trying to sow seeds in dry, arid mud in places that have been decimated by a decade or two of austerity and a very commodified labour market. And similarly, if we start saying, well, let's scale up those great ideas, that's a bit like dumping industrialist monoculture soil on what's already there, rather than really starting with what's in that place. So yeah, really paying attention to the roots and how you nourish and nurture that space and capacity for imagining something different is very important. Very happy to say more about how we're doing that at JRF in a minute. But let me just finish this bit by saying, I think the task here is, there's a language, isn't there, around public services. I spent a lot of time talking and writing and working in and around public services. There's a language in public services where I think, you know, when we start to talk about imagination, there's a risk we start saying, well, we need to harness imagination, or we need to map imagination, or we need to scale imagination. That isn't what I think the task is. I think the task is to rewild our imaginations. Every single one of us in this room were born with this amazing capacity to imagine. And over our lifetime, through our education systems, it gets diminished, it gets taken away. And actually, we need to rewild those imaginations, to tune into, as Charles Eisenstein says, the more beautiful worlds that our hearts know is possible. So I think that's the task. And we need to not kind of start talking about imagination as another set of activities we need to do at the end of the day, but rather really tune back into what is this beautiful place that we're hoping we might leave for our children. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant, very great way to kick us off. Thanks, Sophia. Immy, do you want to sort of set out your stall on this and tell us a bit more about Civic Square and pick up any of Sophia's points if you want?
Yeah, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And it's lovely to go after Sophia. So I'm going to just build and then sort of talk a little bit about the kind of narrative that I think Sophia talked about from our perspective. And I'll do a little bit of Civic Square, but then as we talk, we can talk more about what we're actually doing, because there's quite a lot out there about what we're actually doing. And if you've listened to any podcast of me recently, you'll know that I've said this thing like 100 times. So apologies if you were tuning in for something new. So I think it's really critical what Sophia has talked about. And to be really clear, from my perspective, there is a whole range of inspirations, right, from across knowledge systems, across ways of being and understanding, across and governing across the world, that have this story that you've talked about, the one of a new world emerging at the turn of a time. But of course, we're in Britain, right, and like it's a real kind of challenge for me to be here as a product of empire, and then talk about things that were also built out of the spoils of empire, and then also to be in a position where my career is about fixing what we didn't manage to do with extracting that much wealth. Imagine like what a failed project, right, to like have extracted that much wealth over like 400 years and then still be in the place where our country is like crumbling to the ground. Of course, some of this is by design, but like that contradiction is a considerable one. So the caveat is when I build on these stories, I build on them because I'm sitting within that contradiction of being now within privilege, but also a product of that, and using more British examples because they're relevant to where we're at. But to be really clear, it's really important that we don't think that the beginning of this story starts and ends with our history and our recollection of things, because that is actually at the heart of the problem. even though in order to move forward, given where we are on that brink, I think it's really critical for us to be able to see ourselves within the story of this country. So I think what Sophia for me is talking about is so critical, because a great economist, Carlota Perez, talks about this idea of history not being a set of things that happen one after another. And in her papers that are around socio-technical transition, I think there's a big missing piece about ecology, but I don't think she pretends that she was trying to go there. She talks about this idea of history being a series of patterns, and that we can plot quite easily across, that new dawn of industrial capitalism, the post-war moments in the country, and many things at around, she talks about 60 to 80, but 40 to 80 year periods where you find the shift in what we need to do, what we know, technology, ways of organizing, maybe human-made challenges, wars, many other things. They change the context, right? And then as a result, this society changes its context. The emergence of the NHS and things like the community libraries and the education system, or the moment of Rowntree and so on. And I think it's really critical that these moments, whilst much of the British welfare system was built off the spoils of empire, it's important to also not just glamorize it when we're talking about imagination. And I'll just stick with me on this point for a second, because what happened was that a combination, like if you look at the Rowntrees and the Cadburys, are a great example of a similar story, is a combination of industry slowing down, a number of things coming to them where they're like, shit, things aren't working. Our workers need clean air, better housing, access to green space. They need this, they need that. Things are not working well. We're in a stage of new technologies. We need people to be more educated. We need this, we need that. It wasn't just like some sort of surge of moral brilliance, right? Just like we're all entangled, it was entangled, except in an example like Birmingham, of course, the Cadburys, where Chamberlain, the colonial secretary for Britain, was building the University of Birmingham as this moment of the dawn of a new institution. The Cadburys were building things like Fircroft College, which was about the access to working class people to education. And it was a mix. It was a mix of them being industrialists that understood the interdependence of capitalism, interdependence on their capital and their ability to do that, them understanding because they were closer to the people, like what was happening, and a mixture of really good smarts, right? So a lot of the buildings that now cannot be sold off in Birmingham City Council's upcoming bankruptcy have just really smart covenants on them from the Cadburys, from Louisa Ryland, and all of these things. Some of the things we have the mechanisms and instruments and things that we need to rebuild. And so what happens in that story is you get this moment of that moral brilliance. You get that kind of working people also organizing against their around their needs. And you start to have a story where that meets a number of other things, right? And I think in the example of the NHS, what sort of links to us with Civic Square is really critically that Beveridge, yes, the policy work, yes, the meeting of the post-war moment where no prime minister could stand up and say, can everybody get well? And people are like, yeah, cool. We've got it, we've got to rebuild the country, pick up our trainers, we're off to Parkrun, right? We're going to get well. This country's going to recover from the war. That is not how things worked. Things met in a moment whereby all of that work had, if you look in the years before, things like the Tredegar Medical Aid Society, the demonstrators of working class people in that instance, organizing around their needs, showing what those possibilities look like. And your alumni at Demos are exceptional, right? Because if you want to look at a real life example of that today, with all the additions of the technologies and the way we can share and the things that didn't exist back then, Melissa Mean, one of your best freaking alumni, building the landscape, the demonstration, the policy landscape, the practice, the people of a council estate in Knoll West being part of, at the forefront of that story. Magic. So these moments of the Tredegar Medical Aid Societies, these were in that story of 40, 60, 80 years before we saw the dawn of a new social settlement, a new story. And so the more we understand this, we understand that there is actually a mechanism we can put against this that isn't just about I'm proud, whimsy and woke, right? Bring it on, because there's so much of our spiritual connection with the land, with one another, with the ecologies around us that are often really downgraded as this woo-woo thing. And it's no, it's at the heart of all the knowledge of defending the land and working the land and being in relationship with the world around you. But I also don't think it's like this just like really nice thing, because actually imagine when we talk about at the heart of Civic Square's inquiry is what if the climate and ecological and social transition that we need to go through was designed, governed, owned by the people, by neighborhoods and the communities that live in them, right? It's quite a big what if question, and we've got lots of reasons for this question. It's not like a whimsy, what if they could just like, what if we could sort everything? There's some really deep finance, governance, and other shifts within that, which I can talk about later. But like, it's actually more, it's imagine you being the Medical Aid Society in South Wales organizing around an idea of what if everybody had access to health care at point of need, not if you could pay, at that time in the class system of British society, 60 to 80 years before the NHS even became a possibility. Like, that is a huge what if question. The people who pioneered and stood up through mutual aid, through organizing, through all the things, did not get to go on to see the products of the work they had done along that journey. And it wasn't just those organizers, but it also wasn't just Beveridge. It wasn't also the Tories and Labour taking credit for it. It wasn't just policy. It was this complex, entangled mix of many things meeting. And I think in that plurality, we have to have a lot more respect for one another in what is possible where, right? And also to know that so much of that change can also be embedded at a neighbourhood scale. And so for us, we work on this in a number of different ways. But in that piece of the NHS, to sort of line up a little bit more Civic Square and what we see our role as and what we're trying to do, and many of the demonstrators, like We Can Make by Melissa Mean and all of that, a story that I think is emerging, is that when we then did build the NHS and we built the national system, the regional system, we built one crucial fundamental last mile piece, didn't we? Same in the education system when we brought the Libraries Act to being. We built neighbourhood GPs and we built neighbourhood community libraries. Even Carnegie was at it. Democratize the most amount of knowledge, agency, tools, infrastructure to the people to be at the forefront of uplifting their health, of building knowledge, and in our case, a whole new era now that needs to be democratizing the most amount of skills, knowledge, agency, tools, data, appropriate technologies, whatever, access to policy, like, however we need to think about all of those things. I'm sure your list will be longer than mine. We know that we need a neighborhood scale. The new social settlement will be a new public civic partnership that is rooted at the heart of the neighborhood to upskill, empower, democratize the most amount of tools to the people to co-lead the transition. Not just because it's a moral, beautiful thing to do, because it's flipping impossible to do this any other way. And there's lots of reasons for this. But for example, our take on that imagination piece is that, yes, of course, some of you know our journey. We've been going for a long time now, right? And we were out there. The first aim 10, 12 years ago was to get different voices, marginalized voices, people who were not listened to, whose ways of being, knowledge, practice was just erased from society on stages. You'll know we went through all of this. But now I'm just like talking about simple things like, well, not simple things, very complicated things like retrofit. I'll do a little plug for hashtag retrofit reimagine. Feel free to come and see what we're doing in this national festival with many partners. But we cannot meet even some of the basics of what we need to do under the same systems that have created large government grants that keep coming back to government, that take a house by house individual approach, that look at this idea that we had endless material consumption ahead, that we can keep mining lithium for solar. There's all these contradictions at the heart of it. And what happens then is that you get this massive chasm between the imagination crowd or the people building stuff and the people who think they're doing the serious stuff. When it's like, no, you're not. We're not like you're not looking at what the climate science says. You don't have access to endless material resource, and if you do, it's colonization 2.0, material colonization. It's just the same story again. We don't have the carbon budgets to build 300,000 new homes. So what do? Do you start creating a chasm between us to be like, we're the pragmatists, or do you have to go, we have to fundamentally reimagine our relationship with one another, the land, the materials you use, the way we live, the way we work. Reimagination is not some woo-woo thing. It's at the heart of even the practical challenges of, some of our work with retrofit started from this idea when we saw the Green Homes Grant have something like £500 million returned to government in 2021 because they couldn't get spent. Lack of uptake. And I was like, don't know anyone in our neighborhood that doesn't want warmer, safer, cheaper to run homes, better places to live. What are you talking about? A lack of uptake. So to finish at this point, I can talk lots more about Civic Square, but this is not just a place that you go to for a nice time. You go there to do your inner workings, to unlock something, to liberate yourself in the scale of challenge. And we have to bring it back into some of our biggest challenges, because some of the stories we're telling around net zero, around the way we're going to get there, literally is going to be colonization 2.0. Plus, practically, we're not going to get there without some sort of new social settlement that democratizes the agency to the people. And even if you can't imagine that, we know that in COVID, what we can deliver centrally and what we can deliver locally. As we get closer and closer to tipping points we can't come back from, this is going to be an inevitability. So it's really critical we see ourselves as part of a story of building that new moment, and that we understand that imagination isn't like a field trip we go on. It's really at the heart of some of the biggest challenges we face. Again, like I said, I'm happy to talk about Civic Square in a bit, but I just wanted to share a bit of why we exist.
That was great, Immy. Thank you so much. Lots to pick up on. Donna, hopefully you can hear us and we can see you on the screen. So over to you whenever you're ready.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Ben, and great to listen to Immy. She's absolutely fantastic, and I'd just like to echo what she said right at the start, that you've heard these stories before, and my question really is, why are we still having these conversations? It's just I don't know, a bit annoying that the same people just keep getting wheeled out, myself and Immy included, to tell the same story over and over and over again. The big question I've got for you guys is, why are you here? Why are you sitting in the audience tonight? Do you want to do it? Do you want to make change happen, or do you want to write about it? Are you from think tanks? Is this part of your career to kind of listen to us and then write more articles about it, or do you want to make it happen? I get contacted every day by between 5 and 10 frontline people who want to make change happen, and they're being blocked by their leaders in organisations, in huge organisations, in the NHS, in councils, in government, and they really want to make change happen for exactly the reasons that you've heard tonight. They know that change needs to happen, but they're being blocked. People know that this stuff works that we've talked about tonight. It's been written up about. How many times has it been written up about? Michael Marmot, fantastic case studies about Civic Square, brilliant JRF pieces of work, brilliant analysis on the Wigan deal by the King's Fund, new local community paradigm. I am sick to death of talking about it. You must be as well. You must be sick to death of listening about it, of listening to it, of reading about it, of writing, slightly tangential articles about it from a different dimension. We know what we need to do. We need to shift power to communities, but we're stopping it happening for whatever reason. We're blocking it. And we also know that the current system is unaffordable, doesn't work, completely unaffordable, top-down, transactional. We've got the most centralised state in the world, and yet we persist with this model and try to tinker around the edges of having, a little initiative here or a project here, or let's try a pathfinder or a neighbourhood approach here. It just doesn't work, and we're sick of it. It's expensive, it's boring. I'm sick of being wheeled out. It's, as Immy said last time she met me, which is absolutely totally spot on. It's 5 years ago since I retired from public service. Why are you still listening to me? I'm dead and buried. I live in Scotland. I'm in my bedroom in Scotland. Why the hell am I still relevant? There should be, I'm sorry, but there should be leaders out there now leading this change, and really, and they're not, for whatever reason, because we've still got this stupid centralised state system. The NHS, integrated care systems, what the hell was that all about? Meant to be shifting power to communities, but it isn't. It hasn't. It's just about more centralising of control, telling them they have to save 30%, and then shouting at them for not hitting targets on delayed discharges. It's not about shifting power at all. So let's stop pretending it is. I was involved in writing the guidance for that, and there's nothing more disappointing than seeing what it turns into, which is this centralised control system. So yeah, I'm sick of being wheeled out. I'm sorry. And I love Demos, I love JRF, I love Civic Square. All the stuff you're doing is brilliant, but we've got to mainstream this. We've got to stop describing the bloody problem and start to shift into action on the ground. When we started the Wigan deal, it was right at the start of austerity, and we thought, don't worry, Immy, I'm not going to tell you again. I must have heard it a million times. But about it. It's all been written up about, and I'm not going to say it again. People know what they need to do. The shift in power, the neighbourhood approach that Immy's talked about extensively. And we just need to do it. To find out what's stopping us doing it. Because our frontline teams and communities want it to happen, and yet we're stopping it. And we're just writing about it and producing interesting articles. And yeah, I don't know if you're as fed up as I am, but yeah, let's just do it. At one of our events, I've just stood down from new local, partly because I'm sick of being wheeled out and telling different councils and NHS organisations, just do it. And there's something lacking in moving it forward. Some real lack of courage. And communities want it, frontline teams want it, but something doesn't want it to happen. I'll be honest, I don't think a Labour government would do it. I've not seen anything about community power in anything that I've read. So I don't have much hope there. I sound like I'm going to throw myself through the window into the lot.
Yeah, don't do that.
We've got to do it. We've just got to do it on the ground. Public service people have got to do it. Leaders, frontline teams have got to take that leap of faith and work with people like Immy, invest in them, make it happen. Stop talking about it, just bloody do it. That's all I've got to say. Sorry, Ben.
Wow. No. That was very provocative. We won't wheel you out again, I promise, Donna. I promise. Gosh, where to start? I'm going to pick off a few bits, and then we'll open it up to the floor because I want to hear what everyone's got to say. To pick up on that point around why do we keep having these conversations? Why does it feel like this kind of movement is stuck in a bit of a loop? I just wanted to see if Sophia and Immy had anything they wanted to pick up on that. On the point around local people at the front line just getting on and doing it. I'm not at the local front line. I'm here in Westminster writing these tedious articles that repeat the same stuff. So I apologise for that. But is that possible, or are there national constraints that need to be tackled through something that looks or smells a bit like politics? So I'd be interested in Immy and Sophia's reflections. If you have anything you wanted to kick off on that, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely right. Of course, this. By the way, I love that you get wheeled out, Donna. I mean that I feel sad for you that that's where we're at, because there is a real importance around intergenerational knowledge. Like, when I first came into this work, the Demos alumni, like the Sophia's and Melissa Means, Yost, who's at Dark Matter Labs now, like these guys were all about to go out into the world, and they had taken all these different routes and pathways, and Lord, thank goodness I was in relationship to them when I started, without this silly naive idea that just okay, the energy in new parts of the story we brought was great, but not in isolation, in interdependence. So I do think a good starting place for everyone in this room is who actually are you in relationship with in what people are building and what they're doing. And I think that for me in this sort of conversation, of course, the point I made at the beginning is that it is a plurality of approaches. It is an absolute plurality of approaches, and we will have our own tipping points where suddenly things start to unravel at a pace and things are grabbed, right? They're going to be grabbed, because we're not talking about some small challenges here. We're talking about losing major food baskets. We're talking about the collapse of a good part of society's incomes being able to deal with what's coming. This winter is going to absolutely blow just practical things out of the park, right? Let alone when the social unrest of that starts to play out, when the massive inequality again. I was listening to the author of Tipping. Is it Tipping Point? The book that we talked about, like the catastrophic effect of inequality on society. So even sometimes when we're lording over like people, remember that sometimes they knew some of these basic things, that even if they wanted to retain their wealth, they had a good knowledge that massive inequality wasn't good, right? So we have these tipping points that are going to hit us, a social, ecological, and it isn't going to be a luxurious like, oh, and we'll all gather up here and we'll decide what we're going to do, right? There will be a set of things that happen that, depending on how ready we are and how organized we are, we will be able to deal with them. So for me, do not start from this like weird point. And I do think this is like it's a real, I don't know, it's a British thing, I think, because of a class system. And in India, I experienced this before, right, as well, that like this plays out, this idea that there's a tier of work that's more important than another. Like those doing this to policy work or organizing work or mutual aid work or building the demonstrator work or like having tangible action now, doing the 100-year plan. Like this is really silly. It is an interplay between really strong, thriving ecosystems across that. And that's why I have to really commend JRF for in just how they've like broken through this idea of like, we're just going to be a competitive group of people just going for the same pots, inevitably hating each other, even though we should be like working radically together. And even though there's never enough money and never enough ambition in the wider field around that, it's really critical. So yes, of course, there is something that looks and smells like politics. But the kind of like invisible power system we have created that is like, that's nice, Melissa. You built 2 demonstrator homes in Knoll West, and it has a potential to spread and scale. And if you look more deeply into their work, they have looked at all the leverage points in policy that could enable this. They've done lots of other things. But we over here, the serious people, we're in Whitehall, right? Sorry, not to pick on you, just as these invisible things really do exist. So there is like, for about 10 years, I think if you look back, there was a paper by Jeff Morgan and Indy Johar before Jeff left Nesta, where they just went on a social imagination experiment of what if Nesta distributed its endowment to 20 places across the country and like got out of London, right, and started to build and do. And these experiments are important to have. And like, the best of Demos's alumni are building in institutions or place, or using like that intersection between practice and policy and demonstration and imagination as real people in places, not just as a professional outfit we put on. And we're like, we do that when we come to work, but when we're at home, we're not neighbors. Our children aren't going to experience the same things. It's like some like difference we make between that. So of course, yes, but this idea that the master's tools will dismantle the master's house are not, like, I don't think it looks and smells like we will just do some incremental reform to within the current system, and we'll make some papers, we'll influence like this, all the real decisions happen in the back room here, or we know how to navigate that world. And you mad like people building stuff in places, you don't know what it's really like, the dismantling of that, and ultimately the dismantling of some of these institutions and endowments within philanthropy is one step. It doesn't mean it's the only step, but we do need to have new stewardship and those new imaginations having a chance to go somewhere else, because 400 years of the same sort of stewardship has led us to here. Doesn't mean that all those people marginalized from that space are going to get it right in one go, but they don't even have a freaking chance, because we're having an agglomeration and a hoarding of power, resource, materials, ability to influence in a way that is, I think, really challenging. So for me, like, plurality matters, but this thing between the woo-woos and the serious people, it needs to break down. People really need to go and do some bit of inner work on this to understand, and go and visit some stuff. Go visit We Can Make in Bristol. Go visit your Demos alumni and look at the brilliant intersection between people, practice, neighbourhoods, to know the power you all have, even though it doesn't feel like you might.
That's good.
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard following you, Immy. So, I mean, just like I think what Immy and Donna are saying is so important to kind of listen to tonight. I would say that you know, if you're someone working in policy, if you're someone working in this sort of area, actually there are some things that you can be doing as well to facilitate and enable this that really need to happen. So I think one of the issues, you know, Donna, you mentioned that, you know, community power seems curiously absent from any of Labour's thinking, and I think that is true. I've just come from a meeting about a community power We're Right Here campaign earlier today. There is so much more work needed in that space, but unless it is accompanied by serious commitment to resources, it's meaningless. If you're just talking about, we'll give you power to like imagine some stuff, but oh sorry, yeah, there isn't actually any money, and no, you don't get to steward any of the wealth, and it's pointless. So actually I think the kind of policy agendas around building mutual ownership models, cooperative development of whether that's in housing, in childcare or whatever, there's so much more that could be done there. Similarly around community wealth building, how you move wealth, shift flows of finance so that actually it really can follow those pioneers and change makers on the ground who are building alternatives. That needs to happen, because at the moment, people like Immy, people like Melissa, the people that Immy's talking about, they're having to cobble together multiple crappy little grants from foundations like ours, although I hope we're trying to do something a bit different at JRF. But that is a full-time job in itself. And so actually really thinking about, what do we need to do to shift the way that wealth is held? What do we need to do to shift those flows of money so that actually communities themselves can have resources with which to do the work, to actually enact the futures that they're imagining, is really important. The other thing I'd say on this is that actually imagining together, as Immy says, it's not nice. It's not a like little nice workshop you go and do with some multicolored post-it notes and go, oh, that was fun, and then go back to your day job. I think it's hard, right? It involves confronting some frames, some things that have shaped our lives, some ways of thinking that perhaps we need to unlearn. It involves confronting some differences in opinions, some differences in values between us. Imagining together is hard work. And we have done, so our home city is York. We've just done a piece of work with New Constellations, which if you don't know them, I recommend you look them up. And where we've taken 18 residents across the city on a voyage of discovery and imagination to think about what might York's future look like. At the moment, we have a kind of, you know, York has this sort of identity as a tourist town. It's Harry Potter central, where a kind of one version of a successful future York is, you know, more Michelin-starred restaurants and more tourists. That is not the future that this group of 18 residents imagined. But, you know, that took a lot of time, a lot of curation, a lot of thought about what is it that as a group we need to do and explore together to imagine something different, to kind of get ourselves out of that gravitational pull of the way things are now. So I think this is not work to be done lightly, and we have to make time and space for that to happen, as well as making sure that resources are flowing properly to those people who are really leading the way on this on the ground.
That was great, thanks, Sophia. Before I open it up to the floor, Donna, did you want to come back on any of that before we open up for questions?
No, I think I really agree with what both speakers have said. I just think we need to. I think the think tank world needs to be informed by the practical public service people who are delivering services. I think too much public service reform is separate from actual deliverers of public service. And I think, you know, I've said this at New Local and to other places, that you need to go and spend some time in a children's services department and just see what it's like. Spend some time in a critical care emergency ward, just see it, live it. Don't just keep writing about it, because there's a disconnect, and it's a huge disconnect. Go and spend some time with Immy in Birmingham. You know, just, I think people just inhabit different worlds, and it's got worse, I think, since COVID. So yeah, let's just do it, I think. And I think one of the things that really resonated at the Stronger Things conference that we had was, it's really hard, as both speakers have said. I just think we need to get strength from each other on the ground and nationally, and creating this kind of rebel alliance of people who believe in something different. And just because it's going to be really tough, it's not going to be easy the next 5-10 years. So, I think having rivalries between different think tanks, which just absolutely bonkers. My idea is more perfect than yours. You're out because you've said this, and it's all about selling something. That is really sad. We're all here, perhaps in different ways, selling something. So, let's find what brings us together and form this really deep rebel alliance that is genuinely about public service reform, not tinkering around the edges and not just writing about it, but doing it.
I mean, here, I agree with that very strongly. Final one before I open it up. 'Cause I think sometimes, to what extent do panelists feel there's a need to spread the gospel further? Because I think sometimes when you're in this space, you can kind of think of like maybe everyone else knows what you're talking about. So I started my career as a civil servant in Whitehall, and learning about this kind of different way of thinking, as I'd probably describe it, was incredibly alien to me. And I don't think most people who worked in the departments I worked in had really heard the gospel. So to what, because I guess to push back, not push back, but to challenge what Donna said, I think maybe we sometimes feel everyone thinks like us, but actually does that make sense? Is there a need to spread the gospel further and keep doing it? I mean, that's sort of what I hope to do with these events. Or do you actually think we've done enough of that and we need to try something different? That's my question, really. Yeah, because I feel there's, especially in sort of in Whitehall, there's a lot to be learned still. Yeah.
When I started my career, I tried to get a job in the civil service and got it. Was told shortly after getting it that the only reason I got it is because no one else had applied. So I spent a few years as a civil servant working in the women's unit, and I think. Well, and Paul, who is the chief executive at Joseph Rowntree Foundation, had 20 years in the civil service. We talk a lot about just how much needs to change about what is valued, what kinds of knowledge, what kinds of education is valued in a policy space. And I think the truth is that the way the civil service recruits, and apologies to anyone who is a civil servant here, I'm sure you're brilliant, but there is a narrowness to who is recruited, a narrowness, a kind of worldview, particular forms of knowledge that are valued. There's a kind of hierarchy of what matters. And that's the problem. That's why it's difficult to see what's happening in some of what we're talking about here. So there's a brilliant model that's been developed by Bill Sharp called the 3 Horizons model. I don't know how many of you know it, but we use it a lot at Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And often it's presented as this sort of 3 horizons, as in kind of first horizon is here and now, second horizon is a bit further in the future, and third horizon is kind of a long way in the future. That's actually not really how to use it. It's not a temporal model. It's more about different lenses to look at the present. And the first horizon is very much a lens which is kind of management, business as usual. The third horizon is much more getting into what are the values, what are the principles, what are the glimmers, if you like, of something different in the future. And I think the civil service and the kind of skills we value in policy work are just too narrow, and we really, really need to broaden out the sorts of skills and capabilities that we value in people who are doing that kind of work. And then you'd be able to see it all.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's like lots of ways to look at this, because I think that, that gospel piece, whatever it is, I think it's plural. I literally don't think that we can move in a place that in where we're going at the moment before those really serious tipping points have hit, where we go to the lowest common denominator of what we can all agree on. I don't think that's going to take us to where we need to be, even in our own field. I think it's important to be plural and connected and to keep pushing, because obviously, if we don't actually believe, a lot of the systems we're talking about that need to be remade were human made. Like the land contract isn't the soil under your feet, it's the pieces of paper we've put in between us and the soil under our feet, right? Financial instruments and systems and norms and rules. Most of the things we need to shift have been people made, including the rules of what the economy, for example, values. So that, that conversation with Kate is like a great example of like, this is now not even whether you're like in an imagination utopia world, like the rules of the game are not fit for purpose. And so if we don't start from a place where we believe that human made things that have brought us to here can be unbundled, dismantled, remade, then we definitely have to like give up a little bit and get out the way, because that's actually more of a blocker. Spending all your days, like one of the things Kate says a lot is just don't go knocking on doors, just go where the door's open. Like I haven't got time to be like, because actually a lot of our work is rooted in real pragmatism, real facts and figures and systems. Like if people want to talk about pragmatism and realism, if they start with the data of the planetary boundaries, then I'll be like, I take your pragmatism seriously, right? But they always choose another thing. They choose a thing that allows to gaslight you into going, oh yeah, of course we can only just do that, incremental reform is the only way. So yeah, like in this gospel piece, I think there's loads of ways to think about it. Sometimes that's when we talk about the Tredegar Medical Aid Society, we're talking about these were people organizing around need and their own version of imagination of a society that functions very differently. If we talk about the Rowntrees and the Cadburys, they were a mixture of industrialists meeting the morality, and a massive realization of clean air and green spaces and housing quality had an impact on all of that. But if you need a different frame, like as much as I'm not a massive fan of the electric car lobby, when there was this famous story where BMW were trying to build the electric car and they just kept failing, right? They just couldn't get that innovation out the door. I don't know if some of you know, they were one of the last big brands to get out, and like they just couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. Loads of reasons, all the internal innovation culture things. So they span out entirely. They span out and began like afresh. They didn't even span out, they like started afresh, and then they rebought that back in right into the company. There's a good case study on it about how it works, and shout out to Indy Johar for telling me about that story. Sometimes building things that work better, that make sense, is a really good strategy. Like you'll see the type of traction that we can make is making, because you can see like the housing minister is like in conversation with Melissa because it makes sense. These small sites, MMC, people, good quality density, skills, materials, it's all starting to make sense. They've mapped out policy, they're working with the right people. What tweaks to the current system could unlock it? What radical shifts could unlock it? And so when we're looking at some of these pieces, again, like I said, what knowledge is matters. It isn't just post-its on a paper, on a nice workshop. They've thought about where the land supply comes from, how it's stewarded in cooperative commons. They've thought about the financing. They've thought about affordable rents in perpetuity. They've thought about policy shifts. They've built it. The design code was designed by people in Norwest. The housing list in Norwest can retain all the social and mutual connections if they don't ship people off to other parts, but use the underutilized land in the neighborhood to build with people. They've got a micro factory. They're doing the forest to the front yard. Sometimes building things that work better can be a gospel in itself. But what I would say is that, we make this joke about being trotted out, and like I don't mind that. I don't mind that at all. It's so critical that probably for the entirety of our lives we will have to keep fighting for this, building it, making it, building alliances, meeting new people, finding anywhere where there's a leverage to build it. Probably for the entirety of our lives, and most likely won't even see the boons of that. Right? That's okay. What I don't like is that this gospel piece is that people building on the ground are trotted out for like inspiration. You go, Immy, speak truth to power, well done, like yes, come on, fire us up, to make ourselves all feel better and go, yeah, cool, that was great, like thank God somebody's doing it. It's of course we have to be orators and constant storytellers of a different future, but it isn't just storytelling, it's making and building it, and it's figuring out like what knowledge do we think matters there. Because if you go away and say that's a really inspirational night, I'm going to go and get all my serious stuff, it's like kind of missing the point. It's like people should be thinking like, who am I going to, like Toby Young and Melissa Mean, like policy legend, Melissa, they're working together behind the scenes to like, what are you attaching yourself to? What are you serious about that you're describing that you're going to be like? And so reform is important, but in all the futures that we're also going to face, it's okay to be like, Alistair Parvin talks about this. Sometimes one of the biggest ways to spread the gospel is build something that works loads better and just makes damn sense. Yeah, and then wait for the moment where it's that moment to tip. You can't always predict that. We need to be a bit less controlling about, if I just do this, this, and this, Keir Starmer will take it, and then we're going to be fine. Might not be him. Probably won't be him. Sorry. Anyway, it's all right. Love you, Keir, sort of. Like, it might be something else. You can't put all your hopes and dreams off the first time it didn't get adopted, and you've got to be a bit more like building beyond that horizon and then being ready, or making sure the people around you are ready, or the next generation are ready. I think I've been really lucky to be the next generation to a generation that's been pretty radical with sharing, bringing us together, generosity. That's a really critical part of the story.
Thank you. I'm going to finally open it up to the floor. Sorry for taking a while to get there. Do you want to raise your hand if you want to ask a question or make a comment on the discussion so far? Anyone want to kick us off? Yeah, we'll take maybe two at once. Anyone else? Okay, yeah. So we'll go one and then two. Are we doing microphones, or can people just speak? Oh, I'll pass my microphone. That's probably easiest. Yeah. So just say your name, and you can say if you're from an organisation if you want.
Hi, I'm Dan Jones. I work for Youth Futures Foundation. So that question of like, what are you here for? I'm here because this conversation makes me feel stupid, and I want to get to the bottom of why this conversation makes me feel so stupid. And what you just said makes total sense to me. Build something better. You might get lucky, you might not get lucky, but build something better. Maybe someone create the examples that are different, that when the context needs something different, that example is there to pick up. And that's Trigaliga, and it's popular health, and it's the things that were there that when the context needed them, they went, that could be the National Health Service, right? That makes sense to me. I don't understand what that has to do with imagination, let alone collective imagination. This conversation just makes me feel really stupid.
Hi, my name is Ben Hawes. I worked in technology policy for a long time in government and since outside government. I'm interested in local government. I mean, my experience, I briefly worked on the smart cities policy when 10 years ago we had it for a few months, and then David Willits left, and then we didn't again. And you know, I've been continually shocked over the years by how little help local government gets, you know, on innovation, on you know, digitization compared to central government departments, and how much local public sector has still managed to do, you know, but it isn't great at sharing and spreading things, you know, and there is still a bit much of, yes, it's very important that each place does its own thing, but there is still a bit too much of, oh, we have to invent our own things, which isn't great for inefficiency. You know what, you know, starved of funds and continually knocked back, the local public sector still, you know, still comes up with a lot of great people doing a lot of great work, but as I say, it doesn't necessarily spread. What would you like to see coming for that sector, or what do you like to see given to that sector?
So yeah, question one was kind of, I get this, but what does collective imagination have to do with any of it? And then I think question two was, what should we be doing for the local public sector? Is that a sort of fair summary? Donna, do you want to kick us off, because we've gone to the people in the room first already? Do you have anything on either of those questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry it made you feel stupid, just asking what you're here for, but it's a genuine question. And I think it's just a reflection of the fact that these stories have been told consistently, and you know, it's like, what do you want to make happen? And I genuinely,
wasn't the question that made me feel stupid. The thing, the name, the idea makes me. I don't get what people. I can't get my head around what people are talking about. It feels like, and I'm worried that it's like attractive smoke and mirrors. And if it isn't, I don't know what it is. The question is a brilliant question, because what are we doing here, having these conversations?
Yeah. Okay. Well, for me, collective imagination is harnessing communities, the power in communities, and very often in public service reform, we don't do that. We reform systems and processes without the soil. That I think is absolutely essential that we concentrate on, and investing in the social infrastructure as well as the physical infrastructure, I think, is key. I think the second question about local government, yeah, absolutely spot on. It has survived despite having its budgets halved over the last 13 years, and in some cases, outcomes have actually improved because people have listened and thought differently, particularly during COVID, about their role, and the fact that they can't just have this benevolent paternalism that, Immy and Birmingham, for years and years, Birmingham City Council ignored Civic Square. I don't know if they're listening to you now, Immy, but, you can have brilliant work going on in a locality, and yet public services that don't listen to the brilliant work and don't value it. So I think there's that connection to local government is closer to people than the civil service. It just is by the nature of it, and local politicians. But I do think you're right about not learning. We had more visitors from Denmark and the Scottish government than we did from Greater Manchester, for example, when we were doing the deal in Wigan. And people in the Netherlands were saying, why is the rest of English local government not taking note of it and just, genuinely learning from each other, which is great. And not saying Wigan was perfect, but we tried something different, and it's still going on today, which is positive, because it's a deal brokered by people rather than by public servants.
Thanks, Donna. Immy or Sophia, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, so I think for me there's loads on this, and there's loads of different frames. But I think for me it's a really practical thing. I find Rob Hopkins' book for quite a like for a British audience, I think it's really good because it's really pragmatic. It just roots it in it doesn't need to go to like other layers that I think a lot of people in this country find quite hard, because it's a very different space to like look at a different worldview and go, oh, that's how imagination shows up there. But like for some of the things that imagination for me is about bringing back old knowledge systems that have been erased. So the indigenous peoples have been by like a brute force across the world. The original land defenders who knew about this delicate balance between consumption, whatever we call the economy, our relationship with the land, and knew very clearly in very practical, really brilliant ways that didn't suit like a Western narrative, right? Some of it is bringing that back, because when we talk about a lot of the work we do, there's a lot of people don't even believe it's a frame that's credible. So, for example, when I first started doing this work, if you said that the economy has to have a different goal to GDP, which, because the way we think about our economic systems now are not fit for purpose for what's coming, we've seen it. It's literally a direct link between planetary degradation and dysregulation. People would be like, ha, 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 let's go. There's one thing, she's an economist over here, right? And like that still happened to Kate on public radio, right, the other day. And like the space and momentum of the public psyche over the last 7 or 8 years with that book in Britain, like, but many other examples of it, we got the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, all the, like, suddenly, even if we don't have the tools, people are like, oh shit, yes, it can be about other things. Like, we didn't even think it could be about anything else, because we were told these structures are like, they're like stuck in, right? So when you come to our neighborhood, you will not believe the amount of people who are like, of course. Sometimes the imagination is about unlocking the things that people don't even believe is possible, because the entrenched social norms, codes, rules, what we call the dark matter, the way things work under the surface, are so ingrained, or their imagination, their ability to imagine other worlds is so constrained by material circumstances or whatever, right? Same with like the degrowth conversation. It is just polarized because there's no imagination space where we could talk about, yes, we can grow human ingenuity and imagination and how we've always worked free society, but we need to degrow our material consumption. So for me, it's like a really practical thing because I don't, in the world's, and it's not small, right? It's quite broad. I don't find this, I don't find it something that is a really intangible, mystical process. It's like literally being able to believe that other futures are possible, and that's a process. Because in this field, I'd say the difference between 10 years ago, like not in this room, but a lot of y'all used to laugh at us, man. Like really be like, oh, there's some tweets from the early days. Have you seen what those kids over there are doing? They believe that public infrastructure needs to look like this. They believe that. And now it's like, listen, can you come and talk to us about how you're redesigning that land covenant or that land contract? And it's because a whole generation of people believed, and through many different ways activated in themselves an imagination that's something beyond this story for our economy, for our land system, for all of this thing was possible. Now that can be many different things. Like equally the piece about feeling stupid, I definitely don't want to like be contributing to that, because I don't think that's even healthy in this conversation. But it's like it is loads of practical and tangible things, but also it's okay that it's not, because it's really, really important that we believe something out of this system. And I think for people of like descent, of having had to leave their places because of colonization, it's even more important, because we had a world, a life, economic systems, relationships with the land, resources, connections, ways of being, things that were in, like we had credibility as people, which have all been like washed out as like, not credible, not whatever. So some of the imagination is just us going back and taking things that were also really critical and bringing them into now. So I think it's a combination of things. But yeah, I can just go really practically. 10 years ago, peeps would be like, we're going to need a degrowth of our material economy. Other goals other than GDP, well-being, etc., etc. Same in Wales. The Act for the Future Generations Act, they haven't got all the pieces of how that works. Like the procurement's not working perfectly. Things aren't working perfectly. Even organizations are still scrambling around to figure out how to work with it. But they've set the goal like way, way further. It's now society's ingenuity and imagination that will have to orientate itself to figure out how to get there, even if within our current modes, we don't quite know between now and then. So I don't know. I think maybe there's like there might also be a language thing, a generational thing, embodied thing. I think that these are all many different reasons as to why we're here. So yeah, that's just some reflections.
I'm really glad you're here, even though it made you feel stupid, because actually one of the things I notice, I think sometimes in some of this work around imagination, if you're dealing with things that are perhaps hard to understand or not understandable, something that's unfamiliar, you see a reaction of like, well, it can't be right then. And actually to stay curious about things we don't yet understand or that haven't yet become clear, I think is great. I think there is a sort of pragmatism to the imagination we've talked about tonight. I think any question that starts with what if or how might we is an exercise of imagination. And if you make it as simple as that, maybe that's the way where to start, rather than this language around collective imagination, which can get very, or it can feel inaccessible, feel out of line with the way we see things now, out of line with the sort of British pragmatism that we're all kind of steeped in. So I think, yeah, any questions like that. And I think also anything where you're starting from a position of hope that there is another world that's possible, that is also an act of imagination. And so maybe that's where to start thinking about this and where imagination might have a place. I don't think it's a huge, complicated theory, but I do think we live in a world which stifles our imagination and stops us from really engaging in our hearts and souls, as well as intellectually, with those how might we, what if questions. And on your question about local government, I mean, I think, well, I mean, there's lots of things, probably starting with some resources would be a good start. A couple of things, and Donna's probably definitely much better equipped to answer this than me, but I think one of the things I noticed, we're doing some work in Sheffield, and it's interesting, the importance of creating space. Like, one of the roles I think JRF has played is creating space for local government to be part of these what if conversations. When you're up against it, trying to preserve services like they've been cut to the bone is very, very difficult, you know, when you've got the crisis emails mounting up, to kind of get into that space. And I think there's something there. I think the other thing that really matters is how you resource this very rich civil society around local government, and doing that in partnership with local government, because actually you can't expect councils to solve this stuff alone. Actually, it's the demonstrators, it's the people telling the stories, it's the culture makers, all of those people in a place matter. And it's how you sort of look at that. I talked earlier about this, like nurturing a visionary ecosystem. You need that in every place. That's not going to come from local government alone, but they have to be part of it. So it's how do you resource that? Because the councils can't do it anymore, that's for sure, on the money that they've got.
We've slightly run over and we probably didn't have as many questions from the floor as I would have liked, but we're all welcome to stay for a drink afterwards, but I'm going to bring the event to a close. Thanks so much to our three brilliant panelists, and thanks for the questions from the floor, and you're welcome to stay for a drink if you'd like. So I'm just going to ask for a warm round of applause to bring us to a close. Thank you.